I think at the least, I do have a growth mindset. So I can take criticism. I'm not completely defensive or, like so lacking self-awareness that that won't sink in. So I started looking at it. I'm like, okay, let's assume that perspective is true. What does that mean from my side? And man, it that cracked open the ego just a little bit to real and make me realize what how much dirt was behind it. Because in the meditation practice, there are moments where they ask you to repent your sins, your guilt, your ego, your selfishness, all of this stuff. And prior to this moment, I'm like, I'm perfectly clean. I'm fine. It's all the other people that have all these problems. And then once I realized that, I'm like, holy, everything that I was like projecting onto other people, I'm actually the worst culprit of. I'm the worst
Wow.
person through this. And it just made me feel so shameful of all the things that have happened that led me to this point. And so physically, yeah, I was in a lot of pain, and we can explain it by, these physical phenomena. But I think if you look at it in totality, it traced back all the way to as early as 4 and my childhood needs back then and the mental pattern that I built since age 4 all the way until adulthood.
Folks, this week's guest is my new friend, Quan Gan, tech entrepreneur and inventor. From experiencing over 20 plus years of back pain starting in college to an event that sent Quan to the ER and completely bedridden. What was Quan's journey like that ultimately allowed him to heal himself physically, mentally, and spiritually? You'll definitely want to tune in to hear Quan's story. Let's cue the intro. Welcome to the Boom Vision Podcast, the show that empowers you to live an enriching life physically, mentally, and spiritually. I am your host, Benjamin Ye, and I created this podcast to give you perspectives on how to strengthen your mindset so that you can build optimal health, create aligned wealth, and connect with your higher self. It's all interconnected. Let's get to work. Welcome back to episode 71 of the Boom Vision Podcast. I am happy to share today's interview with my new friend, Quan Gan. I was introduced to Quan through our mutual friend, Danya. After hearing how highly Danya spoke of Quan as an early mentor of hers, and also Quan's amazing transformation from his physical back pain he endured for decades that culminated to a painful event, I just knew I had to get in touch with Quan and invite him on our show. As a brief background, Quan Gan is a tech entrepreneur with a new perspective, bridging the realms of science and spirituality. With degrees in electrical and mechanical engineering and a 15-year track record of creating successful tech businesses, Quan's journey took an unexpected turn when a severe back injury left him unable to walk for months, and the only known way out was surgery. Through meditative and spiritual practices, he experienced a profound awakening and achieved a full recovery within 4 months without surgery or any other physical intervention. His path to recovery required him to let go of the old model of reality and break through his matrix to discover a deeper truth to the nature of reality, a superposition of spirituality and science. So without further ado, here's Quan. Quan Gan, welcome to the Boom Vision Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh man, I'm excited for today's conversation. So I just want to dive right in. Quan, can you start with your origin story? Where did it all start for you? And what's your journey like that's led to your current path?
Well, the origin story, maybe I'll start with here and then kind of jump back a little bit, and then things will kind of fill in because origin story really goes back to as early as 4, but I have to kind of make connect the dots to where I am today. And today, I'm here on your podcast as a father, as an entrepreneur, as a tech person developer who has also found a spiritual path over the past, I would say, less than a decade or so, but intensely over the past 2 years through some just circumstances that have actually led to some pretty significant health problems. And through this journey, it's kind of made me trace all the way back to as young as 4 to basically decouple myself from the former self to relieve and release a lot of the past energies. So I come here today as someone who's kind of straddled both ends of the equation, where on one end is this, very driven, externally driven entrepreneur, go tech entrepreneur, actually very technical too, like with a scientific background. But then on the other end of the equation that I'm trying to balance in this next half of my life, I would say, is pursuing a spiritual path. Not to say that it's separate from the former, but to actually make a holistic connection of both.
Got it. So it's really fascinating because you used the word energy. It feels like, because when we talked before, I felt like we had very similar backgrounds. We both went to Cal, very
Mhm.
technical, very left brain, but something shifted that maybe energetically that made you bring more awareness. And it feels like it was because of the physical journey that you had to go through. Can you go a little bit more in depth about that?
Yeah, certainly. I think, looking back, a lot of this is just really neural pathways that have been built over time. And when I say that, it's basically things that we've accumulated or learned over time. And if we've gone through university or this entire academic path, you can imagine like we get really good at things that we constantly practice over and over again. And so looking back at that, it seems like, we're both very left brain. We're focused on experimental data and all of these definitions of what modern science is, including the word energy in a purely technical fashion. It follows Newtonian, Einsteinian physics and how we use it in our daily lives as electricity or, power and locomotion. So it's very practical, in terms of our daily lives. But at the same time, we've not really been exposed to a completely other side of the coin using the same word energy, which is more from a spiritual or a being perspective. So that side of me was kind of cracked open because I was forced to deal with it through my back pain. You know, quick backstory on that. This was actually, it happened in Cal, my freshman year. One day I was sprinting across the Golden Gate Bridge, and then the next day I could not get out of bed. It was like the most severe pain I've had to feel at the time. And this was about 20 years ago. So I'm in I think this is probably even before 20 or right around 20. And it debilitated me for at least a week, maybe longer, and just lingering pain. And so I went to the doctor to get an MRI and get it checked out. And basically they said there's a pretty severe slip in your disc, which is a bulge coming out of your the disc between your spine, which basically means it's pressing on the spinal cord. And if it's pressing on the spinal cord, it'll cause a couple of things. One is they call it sciatica, which is you'll feel nerve sensations shooting sensations down your leg. And it will also cause back spasms. Basically, your muscles will lock up and create more pain. That's why you're so stiff afterwards. But they're like, they told me that there's no reason that sprinting will cause this to happen. Everybody would run. So it's usually some kind of traumatic event. But there wasn't anything in recent history that happened that did that. The farthest thing I could remember is maybe a childhood car accident. So that's kind of the speculation that maybe it was always there, but then this event triggered it. And since that event, the back pain would happen every few years. And then it started progressively getting more frequent and worse to the point that it was just constant pain for probably 6 months until this culminated at this event that I had to deal with. Ultimately, I came back from a trip and I was popping pills every single day just to get through the day because my leg was in so much pain that I overexerted myself on this trip. And when I came back home, the one thing I try to do to maybe relieve it is to put myself on an inversion table to hopefully stretch out the back a little bit. And that was the worst decision ever because I think it popped the disc and the material inside the disc extrude it out even more. So imagine kind of like a jelly donut. So normally a compression would make the jelly donut flatter. So this donut would kind of expand out and press against things. But now the jelly gushed out, right? So
Wow.
that, yeah, that's a huge amount of material that came out and pressed on my spinal cord. And at that point, I couldn't move at all from bed.
How long ago was
Uh,
this, by the way? Like what? Just
this
a frame of
was
reference.
this was just a little bit more than a year ago. So this was
Oh,
end of
very recent.
January last year. So I'm normally a very active person if it weren't for the back pain. I run a lot, I ski and do all these things when the back pain is manageable. But from that to completely bedridden, and actually in a wheelchair for several months, or being assisted with a walker was quite a big contrast. And throughout these 20 years of back pain, I've tried pretty much every modality of healing under the sun other than surgery. That includes physical therapy. My mom's an acupuncturist, so I went to her first and foremost, right? So, acupressure, chiropractic, physical therapy, and the most extreme one was actually a stem cell injection. So that was pretty, a Western science, right? They would go drill a hole in my hip to pull out the bone marrow and then centrifuge that out and get the stem cells and then re-inject it back into my spine, hoping that the stem cells will have growth factors that can get that area to regenerate. So that probably gave me about a year worth of relief, but I didn't really change my lifestyle. I was very much still go, go, go and doing all this stuff. And then I threw my back out again. And it just felt like a complete waste of time, resources, and money. And this time it was the worst, right? It sent me to the ER. I've never experienced more pain in my life than this particular moment, to the point that trying to get out of bed, walking to the bathroom was like 10 out of 10 pain. I was like starting to hallucinate, like see stars and stuff. I'm like, after this trip, I cannot get out of bed ever again. And this also tied into another thing where normally I'm the person doing all the travel, and my wife is full-time mother, so she's at home taking care of the kids, and we have a pretty traditional hunter-gatherer role in a way. But in January, my mother-in-law passed away in China, and so my wife went back home to China to see her, and that completely flipped our family life upside down. So I have the kids. She is gone indefinitely because we don't know, when she would finish taking care of those affairs. And fortunately, my parents were still around to help, right? So they had my kids that day when I came back from my work trip. But I'm here at home alone and completely just bedridden, in a lot of pain, and my cell phone is probably only like 15% charged. So and also my closest neighbor is several hundred feet away, right? So I'm in bed, basically helpless, with maybe a few remaining calls I can make, and I'm like, I have to. Oh, by the way, and I was very high at the time because I'm smoking a lot of weed or whatever alternative things to try to just relieve the pain. So I'm like, this is really my lifeline. I gotta call my dad at 3 in the morning, just saying, hey, look, I need you to come here, because if I don't make this call and I run out of juice on my phone, I can't even get up to charge my phone. So someone would find me, worst case, I don't even want to say it, just in bed, like in a few days, right? So fortunately, my dad came over and he couldn't get me out of bed, so we had to call the ambulance. And so I spent the next 3 days in the hospital. Well, it shouldn't have taken that long to get an MRI, but for some reason, I also caught COVID coming back from this trip, so they isolated me.
Wow,
So
that's like a
uh,
double whammy.
yeah, it was just like whatever could happen, just happened. Murphy's Law. But the benefit of that was I had my own room to myself, right? They put me in an isolated room. Meals were pretty good. I was in good spirits, even through all the pain. But they pumped me full of drugs just to get the MRI, and yeah, it was significantly worse. But at that point, I had this twisted perception that this was kind of a good thing, because I was so sick and tired of dealing with the back pain for 20 years that I knew they were just going to send me back to physical therapy and go through the same again, which is going to just repeat, because the doctors will always say that someone at your age with this kind of problem, it's not going to get better. It's just a lifelong thing you deal with. So it's the same pattern. And I was so sick of it that I'm like, okay, at least now it's worse enough that they'll probably qualify me for surgery. And, maybe let's just cut this out and get it over with. And the surgery process is actually going into your back and trimming out the excess material so that it relieves the pressure from the spinal cord. It's pretty high rates of success, about 90. But then again, the people who tell you are the people who want to work on you because that's their profession. So they're not going to tell you otherwise. And then being that my wife is actually very spiritual, she's always followed a much more spiritual path and earlier than I have. She didn't want this to happen. While my mom, she's a healer, both an acupuncturist, but she was also a pediatrician in China. And she had some neck problems in the past that surgery relieved. So she was very much an advocate of, hey, let's just get surgery, get this over with. But she and my wife were at odds in terms of what they recommended for me. And my mom is closer because she's still in town. She's, seeing what's happened to me. While my wife is on the other side of the planet and she's calling me, begging and crying to me, saying, do not do this. Don't get surgery because you're risking the livelihood of your whole family. If they paralyze you or do something, then we're going to have to take care of you rather than the other way around. And my drug induced self was just so twisted at the time. And I just said to her, and you can cut this out if it's too extreme. I just said, who the are you to tell me what to do with my body? I've been dealing with this for 20 years. I just want to get it over with. Those were the literal words I said, and just would not have anything to listen to some alternative practice. She and I she's practiced qigong, and I've tried it a little bit, but my former skeptical self just rejected it. My reason for trying it was really just to more understand what she's going through so that I could support her. And actually, the ego was more like I didn't want her to leave me, so I wanted to at least know what she's doing. Okay, so I rejected that practice, and she's like, and here she's asking me to do more of that practice that I rejected. So I was fundamentally very, very resistant. But my cards were forced because even if I did want to get surgery, it would have been at least a few months out in terms of scheduling. So it wasn't realistic. And even if I just purely listened to Western doctors' recommendations, it would just be, here, pop all of these pills on a daily regimen. These are your painkillers. These are your anti-inflammatory. Here are your steroids, this whole concoction of pills. I knew I didn't want that because that's basically the slippery slope to the opioid epidemic in America. It usually starts with some kind of back pain and some prescription, and then you go down some pretty dark, deep places. So I'm like, okay, I can't do the drugs. I still am targeting surgery, but at least help me with some pain relief. So I told my wife, look, I'm gonna do the practice, but in the next 10 days, don't call me. Because the moment you call me, you trigger all of these resistant responses. It's going to make me not want to do this. So if I've committed to doing this, just don't bother me for 10 days and let me sit in silence. And so the Qigong practice we did is, it's a pretty esoteric practice that's been passed down through many generations to this master that we happen to meet serendipitously, or you could say, life circumstances aligned about 3 years ago. And it's a series of movement techniques and meditations that you do, about 2 hours total. So I committed to doing that for the next 10 days. And gradually, I was able to at least wean myself off of all the drugs by the end of this. I was still in pain if I had to walk around or move, but at least I could sit still. So it gave me that piece back. Whereas prior to this, if I weren't popping pills, my leg would be throbbing so hard, even just laying down or any position, I would not be okay. So I made some progress on the pain and got better. But I came through this, there was a breakthrough moment in one of my meditations because my wife had sent me this very heart-wrenching message that was not intended for me. It was actually from my mom to her, telling her all the things that my mom would not want to tell me. And it's basically, look at our son. He's in all this pain. He's all the things we've done for him. He's so thankless. He never listens to any advice from the parents. He's an only child and blah, 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 blah. Just like this complete, rant of all of these things. Well, it's not a rant, but it's just all of these things that she knew I would not be able to listen to. And at the end of that message, my mom wrote to my wife, whatever you do, don't share this with Quan. And so
And then she in turn shares it with you.
yeah, she shares it with me. She's like, you need to see this. Okay. This is how they really feel about you.
Uh,
I think at the least, I do have a growth mindset. So I can take criticism. I'm not completely defensive or, like so lacking self-awareness that that won't sink in. So I started looking at it. I'm like, okay, let's assume that perspective is true. What does that mean from my side? And man, it that cracked open the ego just a little bit to make me realize what how much dirt was behind it. Because in the meditation practice, there are moments where they ask you to repent your sins, your guilt, your ego, your selfishness, all of this stuff. And prior to this moment, I'm like, I'm perfectly clean. I'm fine. It's all the other people that have all these problems. And then once I realized that, I'm like, holy everything that I was like projecting onto other people, I'm actually the worst culprit of. I'm the worst
wow.
person through this. And it just made me feel so shameful of all the things that have happened that led me to this point. And so physically, yeah, I was in a lot of pain, and we can explain it by, these physical phenomena. But I think if you look at it in totality, it traced back all the way to as early as 4 and my childhood needs back then and the mental pattern that I built since age 4 all the way until adulthood, which was, and I say this with purely factual, there's no emotions anymore because I've processed it in the past 2 years. But it's, I was born in China, in Beijing, and this is in the early 80s. The country had just reopened, which means a lot more opportunities came out for people in my parents' generation. So the thing to do back then was to have your kid basically check mark and then send your kid to boarding school while you go back and pursue your career so you can create a better life for your family. Okay, seems that's a very practical thing to do because it just came out of the Cultural Revolution, which closed down all opportunities for a very long time. So that was the natural thing to do. But for a 4-year-old, it meant being removed from your parents for a very long time, for 6 days a week. You only get to see your parents for a day. And then soon after, my mom moved to America. And then I came to America, but she was working and my dad we basically didn't reunite as a whole family until I was age 10. So throughout this time, I'm tracing back to just the lack of security from a childhood development standpoint. And I realized that in school, the only solace or the only thing that I felt like I could control was actually my academics. Because if I were smart, then you can't hurt me. That's essentially the message that I realized that the inner child developed. It's like, if I do well in school, then I create a shield for myself and I could protect myself from any kind of uncertain things. And that triggered some dopamine because I was able to win some awards, get some accolades for that kind of positive reinforcement, right? And over time, that actually gave me a very intrinsic motivation to do well academically. But I also understood as an immigrant, the academic path was the best path to create a better life for yourself because my parents came with barely anything. So I persisted on that all the way through, going through high school, ended up getting into the 2 top universities in engineering, going through those programs, ending up in a corporate job that I realized I hated within the first few months and had to quit and become an entrepreneur. And then became an entrepreneur for the past 15 years, never working for anyone else, didn't have to listen to anyone else, didn't have to listen to my parents, my wife, or anyone, right? It's like I couldn't listen to anyone because I'm always projecting myself as the smartest person in the room. And so that pattern has built so deeply into me that I realized it became my infinity mirror. And if to describe the infinity mirror, it's like if you're you might see this in an elevator where there's mirrors on both sides. And you can see basically into infinity yourself. You only see your own reflection and you don't see anyone else's reflection. So whatever I say as truth, I feel like it's the total truth or the objective truth. But it wasn't until seeing my mom's message and from her, and trying to empathize and take from her perspective that that mirror started to have a crack. And once I saw the crack and I started peeking through it, I realized just how distorted I was and how much guilt I had behind all of that. I basically just buried. And I think that's actually, basically my outward self becoming so separated from the inward self over these years of hiding. I think that's actually what caused the health issue. And if
Mm.
I did surgery or had some kind of external fix, sure, maybe physically it might have given me some relief, but if I didn't learn that particular lesson, something else probably would have sprung up later on. So it forced me to really look at the most painful things in my psyche, to start looking at, okay, what does this actually mean? And treating it almost like a clue in an escape room puzzle. You follow one thread and you start pulling and pulling, and then you realize, wow, there's all of this stuff that I have to uncover. And so since that moment, I started trying more spiritual practices. And ultimately, I landed on Dr. Joe Dispenza. But I also have to preface this in hindsight that I don't think it's that single modality that healed me. That just happened to be one of the things in the sequence that made a huge impact. But for me, having such a left brain focus education, he was the one person that was able to connect the science and the mechanism behind meditation, spirituality to how the cells in your body could rearrange and heal itself, to how you completely can manifest your outward reality in alignment with yourself. So I spent the next 4 months practicing that. But actually, okay, before going too deep into that, I wanted to share there's an inception point where this made it make absolute sense for me. Yeah.
Can I also add something right before you share that Inception story? Just to clarify the timeline. So having that ER moment and then also doing Qigong for 10 days, it feels like that was a pivotal moment in that it's almost like the cracks open for spiritual light to kind of come into your life. Because through that 10-day exercise of Qigong, it helped relieve pain in a way that prior to that moment, pills were the go-to solution. But this is more of a natural way where it's like, oh, wait, there's something here. And further to going down the rabbit hole, when you saw that text that your wife forwarded from your mom, at that point, it sounds like you didn't have surgery. Is that correct?
Yeah, I did not have surgery.
So you
I
didn't
was
opt in because that option was at least 3 months out. So it's like
right.
you need something immediate.
Yeah.
But then this beautiful domino, almost like a spiritual domino effect kind of came into play, where then as you went further down the spiritual rabbit hole from Qigong to now Joel Dispenza, am I getting the chronological order right? And how I'm
Yes, yes. It's so basically I was in bed still taking pills. I was doing the Qigong exercise for the next 10 days, but I told my wife to not talk to me at least, but she still sent me some text every now and then. So at in the middle of the night, I received this text. I'm groggy. It's like, what the hell is this? And I look at this long chain, and it just sent me down this whirling guilt trip in a way, right? That made me start questioning if what all the decisions if I made that I made, if that was actually the best for my family.
got it. Okay. And then the next thing you were going into, that segues into your inception moment. Okay. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. So the qigong was something I practiced for about 10 days, but I still put it down afterwards because practically I was still not standing up straight. I was still very much hunched over, almost like a 30-degree angle. So I needed to find something that was a little bit more, impactful immediately. And I remember a friend telling me about Joe Dispenza years ago, but it didn't really make any direct relevance at that time. So I started doing my own research. He's got tons of testimonials online. And I'm like, okay, is he a quack? Or is there enough backing from testimonials that maybe this is something I should try? So I ended up buying the course. It's about $300, but I was sitting on it for a few weeks. Just like, when we learn stuff from YouTube, We usually 2x it or just kind of listen to it by osmosis. We're not really that focused. And then fast forward a few weeks, I had to go back to work. So I'm at this trade show doing an exhibit, but I also had to bring my walker with me because I'm sitting the whole time. I can't stand for a very long time. So the walker is basically my visual excuse to other people coming to the booth that, hey, I'm sitting down for a reason. I'm not just being rude and not, standing up. But from my side, it feels like a scarlet letter. It's like, showing to the world, hey, I'm disabled right now. Right. So it's, I don't want to proclaim that, but I come back to my Airbnb and just pretty depressed for the first day. I didn't have the conversations I was looking for. I'm in a lot of pain still. And in contrast to a few months ago, I was skiing. Here I'm, bent over with a walker. And I was like, there's nothing better to do, so I might as well start looking at that course. And the first few words coming out of Dr. Joe's mouth was, in order for you to fully learn this, you have to really be absorbent with every single word. Don't just skip any concepts and think you have it, just like the other content you have. You have to really understand this fundamentally. And he even, in his real live sessions, he has people like, after he speaks a few sentences, he has people reflect back and speak amongst each other, because the best way of learning is to teach, right? So we can, better reflect the information. So at that moment, I said to myself, okay, look, Quan, if healing this back pain is that important to you, you've been dealing with this for 20 years, even if there's a remote chance that this might work, then it should deserve full effort. And what does full effort look like? Well, when you were in Berkeley, you aced all of those tests. Imagine how much effort you put into those. You probably spent more than 20 hours on any of those courses. This is a 23-hour course. So if it's at least that important to you, you should put at least that much effort, right? So you've done this before. You have the capacity. It's not like I haven't done it. So it's just something that I have to channel from 15 years ago. So I made that commitment.
Sorry to interrupt, but I'm just curious. What was the course name that you purchased?
It's his progressive intensive online course.
Got it. Okay.
Just
curious.
The first course is about maybe 5 hours long, and the second course is the remainder of 15 plus hours.
Got it.
And it used to be in person. I don't know if he still does in person, but now it's just online. And it's actually the prerequisite for you to go to a week-long in-person event.
Oh, beautiful. Okay.
So imagine it's kind of like, something 101, and then the next level, or, 150, and then the graduate course is, in person.
Yeah.
So I committed to binging this material for the next 3 days while I'm at the conference. When I come back from the conference, I finish dinner and I would just watch it all evening from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. Yeah, no sleep. I got plenty of coffee. And he also said you're trying to activate new neurons, right? You got to break the habit of being your old self. So how do I activate more neurons? Well, I started forcing myself to write with my left hand just to make it even take more effort. So I'm taking notes, doing this, just like pretending I'm back in college, right? And I am in a different environment because I'm in this Airbnb. And when it came to the first meditation we're about to do, I think it's maybe 40 or 50 minutes of a meditation, which is kind of long for me, but I was pretty pumped up to doing it because he explained all the reasoning for all of this. So I'm like, okay, this makes sense. Okay, I'm going to go try this. And I turn around and look into the Airbnb, and I had a flashback to months ago. That was actually prior to this back pain coming to a head. There was one day I had a vivid dream or lucid dream where I was sitting in bed, and it wasn't my own bed, but I was emanating golden light out of my entire body, and the whole room was lit up. It was just like a glimpse of this image. And I wake up and I tell my wife, and she just kind of chuckles because it's kind of ironic that somehow I would attain some form of enlightenment before she would. Right? So we just kind of smile about it and, forget about this thing.
Yeah.
And now fast forward, I'm in this room. This is the exact room from those dreams, from that dream.
Oh my God, I'm getting body chills just listening to that.
And as soon as I realized that and looked around, I just started weeping. Like, it just made the entire process, or all the pain and all of this, like, just feel like it made sense. It wasn't just for some random arbitrary reason, but I had to be there. I had to do that. I had to get on that bed to do this work. And that was my inception point. You know, prior to this, people can tell me, oh, you should try meditation, do this, do this. Those are external ideas. So my subconscious would reject it. But when I saw that for myself, I'm like, wow, okay, I'm meant to do this. So it gave me the commitment over the next 4 months to practice every single day, morning and evening, double sessions, until gradually I was able to heal myself, and my MRI's records will show that. It's a very gradual process, but I can tell you, even after the first day of that meditation, my back felt a little bit better, but more importantly, my mental state and my emotional state was, you know, completely 180 from prior. And so the next day I showed up at the trade show and I had the best conversations. I felt like I was a magnet, like people, the right people were coming into the booth talking to me. Everything already changed in that moment. And so I realized the back pain wasn't even the primary thing. It was changing the mental state. And then over the next few months, gradually, as I start re-engaging with my other peers, they would see me in every few weeks. They would tell me, "Oh, your back looks better. Your back looks better. You seem to be walking straighter." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, actually, I do feel better." I didn't even notice it because it's such a gradual process until you look at, 3 or 4 months down the road. There was one moment or one day where I could finally sleep with my legs straight, finally. Whereas
Mm.
prior to that, I would have to sleep in a fetal position every single day because if I straightened my legs, there would be so much numbness or shooting pain. It would wake me up, and I couldn't, like, I would have to wake myself up to flip over to the other side. But you don't appreciate how nice it is to sleep flat until you lose that body function.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So from that Airbnb moment, it was through the span of, was it 4 months?
Yeah.
That that in a gradual, it's just like taking one step on a staircase. It was very gradual. It's not like exponential, but it was gradual
Right.
but consistent. The key was that consistent.
It
And
was
you
consistent. Yes.
and you did it from morning and night for
Yes.
45 minutes each.
It's about about 45, 50 minutes in the morning and about 25, 30 minutes in the evening. And Dr. Joe shares the reason for doing first thing in the morning, first last thing in the evening is because those are the windows to reprogram your subconscious.
Yeah.
If you do meditation during the middle of the day, it's
Yeah.
harder to sink in and reprogram your subconscious because you're not shifting from sleeping to waking and waking to sleeping. So that transition time is essentially like the window into your operating system. Just like if you're going to reformat a hard drive, you have
Yeah.
to press a certain sequence of keys during the boot up process to get to the under layer of your OS.
Wow. Okay. And I want to highlight something that you mentioned, which I feel is really, really important, is that you made the connection as you reflected back to your 4-year-old self, to that inner child. To me, what I'm feeling is like you recognize the importance of healing the emotional inner child state because that reverberates to what you're experiencing physically. So, because it feels like prior to the ER moment, there's a lot of things externally that seems to be the solution, not to diminish any of those modalities, but it felt like it was almost like a band-aid rather than looking at the root cause.
Right.
But something for you, maybe it was that text that your wife forwarded to you. Like maybe that was the catalyst to say,
Mhm.
whoa, 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 let me look what the root cause is first. And if I start healing that, then that will reverberate out. Is that a fair thing to say? Or
I think that captures 90% of it. So definitely prior to this, and I see this happen with many friends that go through a lot of pain, whether that's physical or psychological, is that we often try to seek the external solution because we feel like we don't have the solution within us. For me, to this point, I have done a lot of personal development work prior to the ER moment. So that was still, though, the motivation was to make better my external world, such as how do I navigate this world by understanding myself, understanding my own personality type, my Enneagram type, all of those things. So it did give me a somewhat of a compass of how my childhood psychology influenced my adult psychology. So it was having that as a foundation of understanding that the message made me take as a clue. I'm like, okay, what does this clue now share with me as additional information? And that broke everything open.
So at this point now, Quan, would you say, I'm not sure if I mentioned this offline when we first talked, but it's like back when I was very left brain, I was very much seeing as believing. Show me the facts and I'll believe it, right? Like I lived in that paradigm. I didn't understand and comprehend what it meant to be believing as seen. I didn't understand. That wasn't my core
Mm.
belief that I wanted to install in my OS. It was more the flip side, seeing is believing,
Believing is seeing. I love it.
right?
I,
Believing is seeing.
I'm taking that.
And no, please do, because I feel like we're very much on a similar path here. And what I wanted to highlight, because I also, as I did research for this interview, I felt you said it beautifully, which I might borrow this analogy, but you were pulling up the notepad and you're saying how from going from 2D to 3D, if you stay
Okay.
in a 2D world, I love for you to share that analogy because I feel like this is symbolic of when you went knee deep into the Joe Dispenza work.
Mm.
It's almost like conversion of a different dimension, right? The 2 to 3D, really it's like 3 to 5D, right? But
Absolutely. Yes.
yeah, yeah. So can you go a little bit down that rabbit hole?
Okay, so this gets into a little bit of my own philosophy search too, which is looking at, okay, what we know now is of a certain dimension, but that also means at a higher dimension, the understanding is way beyond what our current comprehension is, just because we're very limited by our senses. So if you see an ant on a piece of paper trying to cross this two-dimensional barrier, basically a line in the paper, there's really no way to cross that. But from a three-dimensional perspective, you can understand if you could pick up this ant and lift it out of the plane of the paper and put it down on the other end, right? So from the perspective of those on the piece of paper on the first side, it would have seemed that this ant just disappeared and somehow reappeared magically on the other end of the barrier. So in three dimensions to higher dimensions, that might manifest as something that seems miraculous that we can't explain in our current reality. But you have these spontaneous healings, or how I would heal my back without any kind of surgery or external intervention. It can do that. But even metaphorically, to a lot of things that we do in life, I feel like I might be the equivalent of in the fastest car, pedal to the metal, going super, super fast, right? Faster than anyone. That's fine. But what if I'm missing the rocket? The rocket is parked over there, but in order to take the rocket and out of this dimension, I would necessarily have to stop this car, get out of this car, and embark on a trajectory that's completely perpendicular to this plane. And so having that scaffold of understanding or knowing that we are always very limited by our own perceptions, that gave me at least an openness to receiving something that is just unexplainable, versus only being stuck to what we perceive as being the only truth.
Hmm. So the message that's coming through me right now is that I feel the first critical step for that allowance to happen is almost surrendering. You might not see the solution, but the fact that you were curious, right? It's like that Walt Whitman quote, right? Be curious, not judgmental. It's just allowing yourself to be picked up. If you're that ant, the image when I first saw that story you were describing, it reminds me of a Toy Story.
Hmm.
You
Oh,
know, in a scene where you got the little crane and they got the
yeah, right.
monsters coming down, right? It's like you're forever going to be in that box. But
Right.
as you let the crane just pick you up from the dimension and get drop out to a whole different world,
Yes.
it felt like, now I'm using as a bit of a flashback, your initial resistance to Qigong, which was like sort of the first domino that went down. That resistance was like, you see the crane coming. No, 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 I don't want to get picked up. I'm
Hmm.
fine where I'm at right now.
Yeah.
But sooner or later, universe life got to the point where it's like, okay, I can't move anyways. I'm in this, but
Yeah.
okay, just pick me up now, right?
Yes. There's another deeper part to the Qigong thing that I want to kind of hone in on.
Yeah.
The resistance to that wasn't just that it was different. It was the only thing that I realized was challenging my ego. Because when my wife first discovered the practice, she was like, okay, I'm going to go to this evening seminar. You want to come? I'm like, okay, I want to support you. So I go and do it. And after she listened to the lecture from the Qigong master, Grandmaster Qin, my wife just like kneeled on the ground and submitted to her. And at that moment, when I saw that in front of me, I just felt like I lost my wife. I was like, my wife is going to just go off and practice spirituality with this Qigong master and leave me.
Oh.
And so Grandmaster Chin was like a fundamental like cleaver in my life.
Hmm.
So I was very resistant from that standpoint. I was very antagonistic internally to it, but I had no other choice to support my wife. So I decided to even go on to the retreat and learn this. But with that kind of thing baking in my subconscious, is like, who are you and why are you taking my wife away? I was not a good student. And then also when I got that text, that was forwarded to me about from my mom, I started looking at, okay, why am I so resistant to the qigong practice? Is it the practice itself or what it represented? And I started tracing it back to Grandmaster Qin. And the conclusion I drew was, okay, the reason why I feel so uncomfortable around her is because she's the only person in my adult life that has actually challenged my ego. Not my wife, not my kids, not my parents, not my employees, or anyone would ever say I'm wrong. And it was through the retreat that Grandmaster Chin told me that your intellect or your ego is actually your biggest impediment to attaining enlightenment.
Hmm.
And that stuck with me for many years, including now. So yeah, that resistance was quite deep.
You don't get picked up. Wow. Okay, so Quan, coming out on the other side, hearing your story reminds me of like Doctor Strange, right? Like you're going into the metaphysics to understand a different dimension to be able to heal, the physical ailments. But I almost feel like that's just the tip of the iceberg in some senses. Like I'm curious with this newfound practice and appreciation for spirituality, aside from health, how did that impact your outlook in life, in your business, just all across all boards?
So many. So I'll tell you, prior to this, and even up to this point, I'm making a transition. A significant part of my life is a nonprofit called the Entrepreneurs Organization. So I'm an EO member. I volunteer on the board. I do a lot of work. There's quite a few commitments, right? And it's a very success driven world, very go go go, right? That was my previous life. But I'm making a transition out of that phase now because I realize that the things that actually bring true happiness and permanence are none of these three-dimensional manifestations. Is that, the number in the bank account or what car am I driving, what house, or what my family is like? Do I have a wife? Do I have kids? All of these things. Those are just temporary. I would say even this body is just a rental, right? These are just rental experiences that somehow our ego has made us feel like we have ownership of all of that. And whenever it gets disturbed, that's where the reaction comes from. And so how spirituality has really helped me is to develop a relative equanimity towards external happenings, being less reactive. It doesn't mean just sitting there and taking a punch, but it means when something happens and you can't control it, not being so triggered by it that it clouds my true judgment. Being able to sit with both the nice things and the uncomfortable things and just being okay to surrender to whatever it is, because at the end of the day, it's really just all particles moving around.
I resonate that. For me, I didn't understand before. If someone were to tell me everything's energy, money's energy, I'd be like, what are you talking about? I wouldn't get it. And I think through my own journey, and I'm still learning, right? But I think in my own journey, having a deeper understanding of that really helped me not only see life in a different way, but also I make different decisions on where I want to spend my time, my energy, and the people I want to surround myself with. It's a complete different paradigm shift with that. And I can see, you probably have gone through a very similar in some ways, in many ways, actually, in terms of how you're operating your life now versus call it 2 years ago,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. And I think part of the calendar manifestations is how much time and space I give myself versus stacking meeting after meeting. Just feel like you're just chasing one thing and jumping to the next, and keeping myself so busy that I'm unwilling to listen to the inner self. Versus now, I have a lot of time that I purposely have to myself so I can contemplate.
Hmm. I'm curious, as you're going through this journey, Quan, because I think one of the gifts that I'm hearing and blessings I'm hearing is that it's almost a bit ironic. It's like even though Qigong was initially the wedge between you and your wife, once you lifted that perception, that belief, it actually feels like it probably helped bonded your
Mm.
relationship more so, right? And so I'm curious, as you went through this journey, how did your relationship with your wife and mother evolve as you're now, it feels like you're fully healed. Is that fair to say? Or
Yes, I am fully healed, but well, I would say the back is fully healed, but there's still plenty more cleansing to
yeah,
do.
fair enough.
Yeah. So since then, actually, even just before this call, the past month, the Qigong Grandmaster has actually lived with us, and we've hosted 2 retreats on our property. It's been an incredible blessing and also redemption for myself to go through this with a completely new set of lenses. And I also come to realize that Grandmaster Chin has a high affinity for seeking truth on the scientific side too.
Huh.
She's highly intelligent, and she's speaking of quantum science, quantum physics, like the actual mechanisms of how these things happen at a higher dimension, way beyond my current understanding. So to me, like I'm very thirsty for that information, and because she's from China, her English is limited. So was given the opportunity to actually do translation work for her.
Mm,
Because many of the students were Americans, and so just being the translator, I was given such a gift of a lot more information than I ever thought I would have been exposed to. Um,
mm,
so it was a combination of having, a revisit to the practice. And also my wife and I, over the past 2 years, we've both also grown very much spiritually and grown a lot more in self-awareness. So it's helped the relationship a lot, but also to say there's a whole lot more work to be done.
yeah. So you touched on that word, which I want to explain a little more for our audience that are unfamiliar with that term. So you mentioned about quantum physics. In a different interview, you mentioned something very beautifully, which is like it's almost like quantum physics and spirituality sort of meets at the same place. Can you expand on that a little more? Like
Absolutely.
what, in basic terms, using layman words, what is quantum physics and what was the connection point for you with that and spirituality?
Okay. Well, so you're drawing this circle with your hand, and to me, the image I have is essentially like discovering the new world. Back in the early days of discovering the Americas, right? So you go so far eastward, you end up coming back westward,
Hmm.
right? Or you go so far westward, you come back eastward. So it's kind of you're meeting back at the same point again. So one end is science, or current science. I think what's popular is still Newtonian physics. Most people understand Newtonian physics because, if I roll a ball, it's very predictable how it rolls. Very few people understand Einsteinian physics, or relativity, but it is the fundamental stuff that makes our GPS synchronize and all of these things that travel at light speed work the way they do. So there's a subset of people that know that's the truth. And then there's an even smaller group of people that is pushing even the frontier of that, which is studying quantum mechanics and getting into quantum computing. So that's kind of on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, from spirituality, you have all the ancient practices, whether that's Buddhism, Taoism, or any of these earlier ones, which is purely looking from within in your own mind and how that affects your outward reality. And so starting from the center point and looking at these two east and west directions, they seem like they're going completely opposite ends. One is purely physical and what's measurable. The other one is like, if you believe it, you can create it. But where it actually starts coming back around and together is if you look deep enough into science and look at what reality is, none of this stuff in front of us is actually physically there. It's really just, it's all made out of vibrations of fields. It's the excitation of energies in these fields that manifest into our three-dimensional reality that we feel is something that's hard. If I push on this laptop, I can feel it. But what is that sensory? It's really just electromagnetic pushing, forces pushing against each other, but there's no actual two things touching each other if you zoom in so microscopically. And then the other component of that is we've done a lot of experiments historically on, it's called the quantum observer effect. It's like when you observe something, you actually change the experiment because there's an energy exchange between getting the information from the thing you're observing and your receptor. So if I'm looking at something, I'm not an objective viewer that is decoupled from the thing I'm viewing. I'm actually making some kind of an inquiry to this thing. I'm probing it. And in probing it, I'm changing it. It's harder to imagine for, let's say, a physical cell phone. Okay, I'm looking at the cell phone. I can't really change it because there's so many things happening all at once that it's dense, it's solidified. But on a micro scale, every time you observe something quantumly, you are entangled with it and you're changing it. So when you can first understand that nothing is physically actually there, and two, fundamentally, the observation entangles the observer with the observed, that is the way to come around the other end to realize everything really traces back to mind and consciousness.
Mm. You know, the image that comes to me when I'm listening to you talk, Quan, it reminds me of that scene when in the Matrix when Neo first meets the Oracle. And in that first encounter, she was like, "Hey, and don't worry about the vase." He's like, "What vase?" And then the thing breaks, right? You know
Yeah.
what I mean? And then she's like, "Well, what's gonna really bake your cookies if how it would have happened if I had said something?" But
Right.
it's almost like that mere act of observing changes things. And that's just a image that just came to me when I'm listening to you talk.
Yes. Oh, and just kind of taking that thread a little bit further, I think we have the common perception of reality is that time is also linear, is that there's a cause and an effect because there is a before and after, because that's just how our current perception sees things. But even that is a questionable reality, or rather, that might just be that's a projection of a higher dimensional reality that there's a before and after. When we look at, let's say, the Earth and the Moon pulling each other and having a mutual orbit, we never say because the Earth pulls on the Moon, then the Moon pulls on the Earth. It's not a causal effect. It is both of them having a mutual gravity towards each other, right? They're basically rotating around a center of mass mutually. It's a co-emergent behavior. And I think that is also true from cause and effect. Cause and effect to us on a linear path seems like something happened first and then it caused a second thing. But in reality, in a higher dimension, I think cause and effect mutually cause each other.
Wow. Okay. I think we're going down a very, very interesting rabbit hole here because it's like, I see what you mean because it's almost in some senses, it's like without that object coming into the picture, there wouldn't even be a relationship for cause and effect. So in some senses, like it's like takes two to tango in a very simplistic way
Oh yeah.
to say it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's I like to call it the Tom and Jerry effect. It's like they have to both be there for this thing to even work.
Yeah. Oh man. Dude, it feels like I could jam with you for hours, man.
Me too. Yeah.
So Quan, let me ask you something. What advice can you give our audience if anyone's going through some physical challenges or just call it, I'm just going to say obstacles and challenges as in general. From your own experience and journey, what is the one advice you can share with someone to help them get around that roadblock?
It's very simple. It's to be okay with spending a lot of time alone. Be okay with that.
Can you go a little
Yeah.
bit further on that? Because I think that's very profound in what you just shared.
Yeah, I'll extrapolate this to, let's see. This was right after I graduated. I'm at work. I think I just ended a relationship, and so I was alone and living in my own apartment. And I just remember I would dread coming back home because I had nothing to do. I had no one to talk to. So I would try to find excuses to go out and hang out with other people. Whereas in contrast to now, I love, spending a lot of time alone. But looking back then, it was more like the ego needed to find a sense of identity through others or external means. So it had to constantly externally engage because engaging the external world is what created a reflection of its own existence. And that creates comfort for the ego. But being able to put that down and just sit with oneself or walk with oneself without any external input for long periods of time to fully understand oneself. I mean, I think that's the definition of meditation, isn't it? To be familiar with oneself.
Yeah.
I think that's the key.
So, what messages just came through me right now? It's like I'm gonna use the one you just used earlier, which is Tom and Jerry. It feels like before, whether you're Tom or whether you're Jerry, you needed that counterpart externally to help validate this circular relationship. But when you allow yourself the permission to be with yourself, it's almost like, what if you were to redefine Tom and Jerry as within you, your inner
Mm,
child in you?
yeah.
That becomes very, very, very powerful because then it's almost like the the inner power rather than it externally.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. I think it's from a neurobiological standpoint, our senses is what gives us external input into this processor, right? And then it changes our behavior, so we output back into the real world, and so it becomes a cycle. And if we keep having the same behavior, then our neural pathways actually carve very deep grooves into our brain with these set behavior, which may serve us or it may not serve us. Oftentimes it doesn't serve us. These patterns are just repetitive, or you could say it's kind of a form of addictive behavior. So when one changes themselves and basically starts decoupling themselves from the external world and reflecting back in, so having this Tom and Jerry dynamic inside the body rather than having it in an outward relationship, that's when change happens because now you're no longer anchored to these patterns that are so set because the external world dictates that you have to be that way.
Hmm. So, Quan, in wrapping up, there's a question I always ask my guests, which is that if the DeLorean was real and time machine and time travel is possible, my question to you, Quan, is how far back and at what moment would you travel back to if you can meet with your younger self? And in that moment, what is the one thing you would want to share with your younger self?
Well, I mean, I don't think I would actually do that because in observing it, you're also changing it, right? So
Yeah.
there's an entanglement there. And I think, I'm always exactly where I need to be. So all of those things had to happen. I wouldn't be here talking to you if all of those things didn't happen,
Mm.
right? So at any given moment, this present moment is the only gift. So going anywhere else, that's really just that's a projection. So I don't think sure, do I want to? Is it interesting? Is it a curiosity? Yes. But at the same time, I'm not sure that would give this soul the biggest value that it can get.
Mm. Okay. That's the first time I heard that kind of answer, but I love it.
Okay.
It really gives a glimpse of where you are energetically and spiritually, you know? So I get that. I felt that. Okay. So last question, Quan, is where can our listeners find you?
So my main mission that's external is actually a interactive game designed to get kids off of screens and back to face-to-face interaction. It's called ZTAG, ztag.com. I exhibit at a lot of trade shows. We're trying to get these into after-school programs, into camps. So basically, that's my external engagement. And through that network of people who are trying to serve other kids and getting them more socially and physically engaged, you'll probably meet me and then get my contact information, and then we can have a one-on-one. But other than that, I actually stay off of the social platforms intentionally. My company is on social media, but I try to, have a pretty secluded life. In fact, I live in the middle of nowhere anyways, just by design.
Got it. Quan, Thank you so much for sharing your time with me today. It's very not only enlightening but profound in witnessing and hearing the journey you've gone through. And my hope is that for the listeners that have listened to this interview, that it inspires and sparks what is possible, what is possible. And so thank you so much for joining us today, man. I really appreciate you.
It's an honor to be on your podcast and to be able to share this journey. Thank you so much.
Man, I am grateful to have Quan join our show today. I appreciate the nuggets of wisdom and analogies that he shared. There's two quotes that I feel best highlights today's interview. The first one is meditating is also a means for you to move beyond your analytical mind so that you can access your subconscious mind. That's crucial since the subconscious is where all of your bad habits and behaviors that you want to change resides. This quote is by Dr. Joe Dispenza. The second quote is, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. This quote was by Aristotle. If you feel moved by Quan's story, please share this interview with someone you feel can benefit from hearing his story. If you haven't already, I also invite you to hit that subscribe button to this Boom Vision podcast if you are ready to thrive together, mentally, physically, and spiritually. Until next time, folks, be kind to yourself. Be in the light. Be you. Thank you so much for tuning in to my Boom Vision podcast. If you'd like to find out more about me and this podcast, head over to benjaminyeh.com. That's spelled BenjaminYeh.com. If you haven't already, click subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.